A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing, our helper he amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe, his craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. On earth is not his equal. If we in our own strength can fight, our striving would be losing. We're not the right man on our side, the men of God's own choosing. Ask who that may be. Praise Jesus, it is He, the Lord of hosts, His name, from age to age the same. And He must win the battle. This world with devils filled should threaten to undo us. We will not fear, for God hath will His truth to triumph through us. And all this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us. We will not fear, for God hath will His truth to triumph through us. Whoa. Fortress is our God. His kingdom is forever. A mighty fortress is our God. His kingdom is forever. A mighty fortress is our God. His kingdom is forever. A mighty fortress is our God. His kingdom is forever. 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 If we in our own strength can fight, our striving would be losing.
safely to arrive at home. Jesus saw me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God, He to rescue me from danger, interposed His precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily unconstrained to be. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy courts above. All else I adore your name. Above all else, tune my heart to sing your praise. Above all else, I adore your name. Above all else, tune my heart to sing your praise. Above all else, I adore your name. Above all else, tune my heart to sing your praise. Above all else, I adore your name. Above all else, tune my heart to sing your praise. The highest praise, the loudest praise, to the name above every name. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy courts above.
I want you to imagine this morning, right now, Jesus walked through the doors of the church right up to you. What would your reaction be? How would you respond to Jesus? Would this be a moment of great joy for you? Would this bring forth just every positive emotion you could possibly imagine? Would you fall on your knees in prayers? Would you burst into tears just out of joy? Maybe this would be a moment of extreme anxiety or even a little bit of fear. In contrast to this, I want to ask another question. If Jesus walked in the church this morning right up to you, or maybe when you're at home or at work or just walking around in your community, what do you think Jesus' response would be to you? Today, we're going to be continuing our series looking at the Gospel of Mark. And actually what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at one of the more famous stories in not just the Gospels, but all of the Bible. If you've been in the church for any amount of time, it's a story you get to hear more or less every Palm Sunday. The triumphal entry, Jesus arriving in Jerusalem and all the people praising him. And we're not just going to take a look, though, at the triumphal entry. We're going to take a look at what happens immediately following. How it contrasts with what the people think Jesus has come for and what Jesus has truly come for, not just in going to the cross, but in that very next day. So if you go ahead and open your Bibles, we'll be in Mark 11. We're going to start off in verse 1. It says, "Now when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples and said to them, 'Go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter into it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, "Why are you doing this?" say, "The Lord has need of it," and will send it back immediately.' And they went away and found a colt tied at a door outside in the street, and they untied it. And some of those standing there said to them, 'What are you doing, untying the colt?' And they told them what Jesus had said, and they let them go." This passage picks up immediately following where we were last week. Jesus and his disciples, they're traveling the countryside, but they're traveling with a very specific purpose. They are heading to Jerusalem. They're heading to the temple. It's the Passover week. They're going to the biggest celebration. And today, or this moment, they're just outside of Jerusalem in the city of Bethany. Most historians believe they're at the house of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And Jerusalem sits just 2 miles away. And Jesus, he goes to his disciples and he sends two of them forward, most likely into Jerusalem itself or kind of the surrounding area. And he says, "You're going to go ahead and you're going to go in and you're going to grab a donkey and you're going to bring it back to me." And the way it kind of reads is that the disciples go into the town and they find a donkey and it, more or less just kind of take it. It almost reads like they're stealing it, and then they pull some Jedi mind trick over the people and they're like, "Oh, just let it go." But really what historians believe is Jesus has set this in motion. He would have multiple times throughout his ministry gone to Jerusalem. And he would have likely have met the people who owned the donkey. He would have set this up ahead of time. And really when they're telling them that the Lord has need of it, it's almost like a code word that those disciples are representing Jesus, and those people know at that moment they're to let the donkey go and it's going to come back to them and it's going to serve a purpose. And Jesus is going to take this donkey and he's going to ride it into Jerusalem in his triumphal entry. And it has a lot of symbology in it. It's this contrast of what warrior kings would do. They would ride their war horse into the city on a chariot. In fact, Pilate himself, maybe even that very same day, would have ridden a war horse, a chariot surrounded by his legions into Jerusalem. And it represented victory and war. And here's Jesus riding a donkey, representing peace. But it's not just that. He chooses a donkey for a very specific reason. This is another time in which Jesus is fulfilling prophecy on the conservative estimate out of over 300 times. Zechariah 9:9. "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And it says that as they bring the donkey, the colt back to him, it says, verse 7, they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut from the fields. Jesus is now riding the donkey amidst all the people. And there is a great throng of people. This is the Passover celebration. And scholars believe that Jerusalem at the time would have swollen to maybe 10 times its normal occupation. Hundreds of thousands of Israelites moving to Jerusalem at the same time Jesus is. There would be a mass of people around him. And they see Jesus and they break out in the celebration. They break out in the cheer and worship. It says they're laying their cloaks on the ground in front of him. This was a symbolic gesture. It was done to recognize royalty. And here they are, recognizing Jesus as their Messiah, the King of Kings. He's arrived in Jerusalem. He's arrived as what they hope to be the conquering king. And they lay out palm branches, this sign of either victory or peace or both. And they're not just praising and shouting and celebrating with their actions. Their words are doing the same. It says, and those who went before and those who followed were shouting, Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. They're praising Jesus as he rides into the city, shouting out Hosanna, which literally is God save us. The excitement is palpable. They're celebrating everything. Their Messiah has arrived. He's going to overthrow the Roman government. Everything's going to be as it should. And here is Jesus, their king. And they just pour out adulation. They pour out worship. And I look at this story, and as I look at it, if you separate it from everything else that we understand, the context of the Jewish people at the time and what comes after, it seems perfect. This is exactly as it should be because Jesus is worthy of worship. And here they are worshiping him, Creator, Redeemer, Messiah, King of Kings. And he is receiving all the worship that he is worthy of. They're shouting it out with their words. They're proclaiming it with their actions. And it's a good reminder for us. It's a good reminder for us again that this is the right heart, the right posture towards Jesus. He is worthy of our worship, and we should therefore give him worship. We should be a people who are marked by our worship. And yet, what I find for myself sometimes is I am not a person of worship like I should be. Because I want to look like this. I want people to look at me and say, man, I know what Drew's about simply by what he proclaims and just celebrates. Just before this sermon at your campuses, we had this time of worship, of musical worship, in which we're just proclaiming the praises of God, honoring for him for who he is. And I just want to ask, what was your posture during that? What were you doing in that moment? Because I think for most of you that I've talked to, you desired to worship God, but in that moment, is that where your body was? Was that where your mouth was? Because I know for myself, this is what I want to look like, but too often I don't. I get caught up in my head. I get caught up worrying about myself instead of the focus being on God. I'll be out in the seats and I'll be singing, but really what I'm doing is just mouthing along. Because in my mind, right, maybe it's a song I don't really like. It's not my favorite song. It's not the contemporary Christian music that I would have chosen. And what I need to remind myself is this isn't for me. The song's not for me, it's for God. Or I mouth along because I know about my voice and I know that I cannot hear if I'm on key. I can hear other people whether they're on key or not, but I can't hear, however my body is wired, I cannot hear whether I'm on key. And so instead of shouting out in worship and singing loud, I sing quiet or I mouth the words because I don't want to offend the people beside me. I don't want them to look at me and go, man, that guy has a terrible voice. I'm more concerned about the opinions of people around me instead of just praising God. And I want to have a body that is worshipful. I want to raise my hands in worship. I look around at the people around me doing it, and I think, man, look at how everything about them is worship. Not just their words, but even their hands. And I get caught up as I look around thinking, well, what will people think if they look at me with my hands in the air? Will they think I'm some weird guy? He's a little bit too charismatic for me. And it's so ironic because I look at the people with worship and I think the highest of them, I don't look at them negatively. And yet when I think about it myself, I'm thinking everybody's going to look at me negatively. Do you not just believe that Jesus is worthy of worship, but does it actually lead you to worship? And if not, I just challenge you to check yourself. Check your motivation. Check what is holding you back. Because I want to be, and I think a lot of us want to be, we want to be like David, who we look at as, I will become even more undignified in worship. I'm not going to worry about other people's thoughts about it. I'm just going to worry about what God receives from me. Now, the story, when you look at it, the Israelites, by all account, they got it right. They were worshiping God. They were worshiping Jesus, who was absolutely worthy of worship. But what's so interesting about it is they were doing it for all the wrong reasons. They were worshiping Jesus because they had a counterfeit view of who he was. And I say that, and you got to understand that they were doing their best to understand Scripture. It wasn't because they were all hard-hearted, although some of them were. They had a misunderstanding of who Jesus was. They thought he was showing up to conquer Israel, to conquer Rome, to elevate Israel. And that's not what was happening at all. What is happening in this passage is what Mark leaves out. Actually, only Luke writes about. But what we see in verse 41, it says, and when he, that's Jesus, drew near and saw the city, he wept over it. In the midst of all this celebration, in the midst of all this worship, we find Jesus not joining them in the celebration, but instead weeping over the city, weeping over its people. He sees them and he is struck by grief for them. He is deeply saddened. The next verse, verse 11, is kind of this interesting transition point in the midst of this passage, this transition from the triumphal entry to what Jesus is going to do the next day. And it's a very interesting passage because it seems like a very odd detail from a guy who's not really detailed in Mark. It says, and he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So here comes Jesus, and he rides the donkey into the temple. He arrives in the court of the Gentiles, and he just stops and he looks around. And I really wonder, at this moment, is this celebration, is it still ongoing? Are still people shouting his praises, shouting Hosanna, celebrating the arrival of the King? Is everything externally looking great because internally something is going on with Jesus? There is a storm brewing. He is looking around. He's weeping. I don't know if he's continuing to weep physically, but internally his emotion represents that there's anger and disappointment and great sadness as he looks around and sees everything. And he leaves knowing that the next day he is going to come back to address everything he has seen. Why he has come to Israel, why he has come to Jerusalem, why he's come to the temple, is going to be put into action. It's not just because he has come to die on the cross. He has some things to take care of before that. In verse 12, it says, on the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it. So the very next day, Jesus and his disciples, they're heading back to the temple. And Jesus is hungry. He's often hungry because he's He's so deeply involved in the ministry, he often goes without food. And he's hungry. He sees this fig tree in the distance, and he goes to it to eat. And this story has always been one of the more interesting ones in the gospel. One I remember as a kid looking at Jesus and going, what in the world is he doing? Why is he so mad at a fig tree? Does he just really not like figs? Or he just really doesn't like this tree in particular? There have been scholars who have taken this and written some very sad things. Jesus acts like a petulant child in the moment. But this fig tree story is actually deeply symbolic. He is making an analogy of the fig tree to Israel. And when it says the disciples heard it, the understanding is they understood at some level what Jesus was doing, particularly after what is going to happen in the next passage. The story of the fig tree isn't really about a fig tree. See, what we miss now 2,000 years later, the disciples in the midst of this would have understood at some level. The fig tree in the Old Testament was often a representation of Israel. And Jesus isn't cursing the fig tree just for the sake of cursing the fig tree. It has to do with his judgment upon Israel. See, as Jesus goes out in the morning hungry, he sees this tree in the distance. He sees this fig tree, and it is in leaf. It's early spring. The leaves of the fig tree are out, and he knows that, hey, there's not going to be figs on it. That comes later, but at this moment, there is going to be fruit. See, at the time when the leaves come, so does a bud. And this bud will fall off and be replaced later by figs, but this bud is still fruit. It is still edible. And so Jesus sees this fig tree, in essence saying, I'm open for business. My leaves are out, so my buds are here. And Jesus comes to it, and there's no buds. There's no fruit. And the problem isn't that it's a fig tree. The problem isn't it doesn't have figs. It's a problem it has leaves, but it doesn't have anything that's supposed to go with it. The fig tree should have fruit. And being symbolic of Israel, what it's saying is that Israel should have fruit. Ultimately, God's people should be fruitful. God's people are made to be fruitful. And he is casting judgment on the fig tree as he will cast judgment now on Israel. He says, you, Israel, you have all the trappings of religion. You're God's people. People know that you're God's people. You have the temple and everything points to God, and you have all the rules and you keep them all. But ultimately, you have no fruit, and you're supposed to have fruit. The fig tree, you're supposed to have fruit. And what we're going to see next is how he carries out this judgment. It says, and they came to Jerusalem. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. Jesus comes back right to where he left the previous evening. He's standing once again in the court of the Gentiles, and as he looks around, he sees exactly what he saw the day prior. And his temple, his place of worship, has become a market. It's become a thoroughfare. And he's just deeply saddened and angered and disgusted by what is supposed to be a place of worship and what it has become. He turns over the tables. He drives out the money changers. He blocks the way. See, what had happened in the courts of the Gentiles is under the direction, not just the oversight, but the direction of the high priest Caiaphas, is they had changed this into a marketplace. There were people all throughout the court who were selling animals, not just for the sake of selling animals, but they were selling animals to the people coming for the Passover celebration. They were selling them animals for their sacrifice. And there were a lot of people coming. For whatever reason, maybe they didn't have animals, maybe because of Rome, they had to seize, whatever it may be, they needed an animal to offer for a sacrifice. And there were people in the marketplace ready to sell it. But the big problem was how they were doing so. They weren't there to help their fellow countrymen. Historians believe that they were marking the price of the animals up 16 times their original price. So if they were buying a pigeon at, say, $1, they were charging $16. Or a lamb for $100, they were charging $1,600. They were more or less extorting these people coming to pay worship, to pay reverence, to repent, to offer a sacrifice, and they were taking advantage of it. And not only that, there were money changers in the temple. See, to buy the animals in the temple, you could only use Jewish currency. And so here were the money changers. With the Jewish people come who often didn't have Jewish currency. They had Roman currency as they're now Roman citizens. But they can't use that. So there's money changers now taking Roman currency so they can have Jewish currency to buy 16 times marked up animals. And in doing so, they were charging exorbitant rates. All these people coming to worship, all these people coming to offer a sacrifice, taken advantage of, all under the direction of the religious leaders, the people who were supposed to care for them. And not only that, but under Caiaphas, they had made the court of the Gentiles a shortcut through the city. The people he's blocking, that he's not allowing them to carry anything through the temple, it's not that their business is in the temple. They are literally going from one end to the other, carrying through whatever they have, their business. And Jesus is saying, this isn't a shortcut through the city. Go around. Go around, have reverence, have respect for the worship of God. And then he gets down to his teaching. And he ultimately says, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. He says, you have this temple, this place to worship and honor and sacrifice to God. The Holy of Holies resides in the center. And here Jesus is the Holy of Holies saying, right, this is a place that wasn't just for the Jewish people, it was a place for all peoples. The court of the Gentiles was so pagans and idolaters could come and repent and sacrifice and pay honor to Yahweh. And the Jewish people of the time had taken that away. They had taken a place of worship and made it a place to profit. The Jewish people, the nation of Israel, was always supposed to be a blessing to the nations. And Jesus says, you've now just become a blessing to yourself. You have lost your fruit. And he cast judgment on them. God's people should be fruitful. And this story is specifically about Israel. It is about a specific moment of judgment that Jesus has. But it is a great time for us to reflect on, are you and I producing fruit? You were created and you were redeemed to produce fruit. And so going back to that question I asked at the beginning, if Jesus showed up today at church, at your home, at your place of work, and he came up to you, what would his response be? And I want to be really careful with this question, because this isn't a response in relation to your identity. This isn't what Jesus come up and be disappointed in you or disgusted in you. Would he judge you and get rid of you and throw you out? Would he stop loving you or be displeased with you? That's not what I'm getting at. But if Jesus came up to you, would he see in you fruit? Would Jesus come up to you? Would he come up to me and say, well done, good and faithful servant? Or would he come up to you and say, I would rather you were hot or cold. Instead, I'd just rather vomit you out. We are to produce fruit. Are you producing fruit? Is your life marked by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control? Is fruit evident internally and externally in how you treat others? And if it's not, the question isn't so that you feel shame, that you go home feeling defeated. It's a reminder that how you produce fruit isn't really about you. You don't produce fruit by willing it forward. You don't produce fruit by picking yourself up by your bootstraps. What Jesus himself said is, he is the vine and we are the branch. And I'm paraphrasing, but ultimately he says, you as the branch, you don't produce anything. He produces the fruit. Our job is to abide. So if you're not producing fruit, Don't go home and feel defeated. Don't go home and just say, woe is me. Don't go home and say, I'm just gonna try harder. Simply abide. Spend time in prayer, in God's word. Delight in his victory on the cross and the eternal hope that we have. Spend time in Christian community, a community that speaks the gospel into all aspects of your life. If you desire to produce fruit, Jesus desires you to produce fruit. If you desire to produce fruit, you don't will it forward, you simply abide. He's going to go ahead now and verse 18, and the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. All of this, the religious leaders are watching Jesus, and they are greatly angered. It says, in response to this, they seek to destroy him. In the original Greek word, it's not just like a general destruction. It's not they want to destroy his career, ruin his rabbiship. The word destroy is specific, destroy in the sense of kill. They want to kill Jesus for what he has done. And Jesus leaves. He returns to Bethany, likely again, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' house with his disciples. And there's one last part to this story. There's one last part. Again, they're going to revisit the fig tree. It says, as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. They come out again to the fig tree, and the disciples see it, and the fig tree has died. Jesus didn't just mean like this fig tree is going to exist without producing any fruit. It's not going to produce fruit ever again because it's dead, it's gone. And in response to this statement, he's going to teach, but to clarify what I mean by teach, he's not going to teach what is the meaning of the fig tree. The disciples would have understood fairly well what the lesson was, particularly after what happened in the temple. They understood the connection between the fig tree and Israel. They understood Jesus' judgment. They understood that a lot of historians believe they understood at a very deeper level that it had to do with the coming destruction of the temple. They were on board with that. And so when they say this and Jesus starts teaching, it's not here's what the fig tree means. It is instead, here's what you do in response to the fig tree. Because they're looking at it basically going, what now? You rode into the city, Jesus. You rode into the city as the Messiah, the conquering king, and then you judged Israel. What's going to happen now? Everything seems to have fallen apart. You didn't restore Israel, you did the opposite. What now? What do we do now when everything seems like it's fallen apart? And he answers them and says, have faith in God. And it's a great reminder for us whenever everything feels like it's falling apart, whenever it feels like God has lost control. Have faith. Have faith in God. He continues expounding upon that. He says, truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Again, let's keep this statement in the context of what's going on. They're distraught. They feel like everything has fallen out of control, that God's plan for Israel is now vanished, that Jesus is not bringing forth what they want. This statement isn't in context of the disciples going, hey, how do we pray and get whatever we want? How is God our vending machine, our genie? He's specifically addressing a very specific feeling that the disciples had. He says, have faith in God. And then he says, and pray and trust in God that he still has a plan to move forward. And he uses what is a common idiom about the mountain. What seems insurmountable or impossible to man. And he points to God has it in control. God can accomplish what now seems impossible. where it looks like defeat is at hand, do not worry. God is still in control. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. We got to keep that whole statement within the entirety of the Bible. God's not a vending machine. Our prayers are to align with his will. This passage with some other ones have been very twisted to this idea of like name it and claim it. Or if you don't receive from God what you asked for, it's because you didn't have enough faith. Instead, Jesus is pointing to them in these moments of doubt, in these moments when everything is falling apart. Pray to God. Trust fully in him. He is still in control. It goes on, and whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. He's pointing ultimately to the cross. He's pointing to him. He's saying we are to be a people of forgiveness. And he is speaking something very specifically to them at this time. This is pre-cross. They are under a conditional covenant. It is a requirement for them to forgive. This doesn't carry across. We exist now in an unconditional covenant. God's working in our lives, God's salvation of us is not dependent upon whether we forgive other people. It's important that we forgive. In fact, we are equipped to forgive because of Jesus. But if we have to forgive to be forgiven, the gospel is no longer a gospel of grace, but a gospel of works. This is another passage that has been twisted, taken completely out of context to mean something that it's not to mean. Forgiveness is important. It is a marker of the fruit that was supposed to be produced in us. But it's not a requirement for our salvation. Ultimately, in all of it, as the disciples are looking at Jesus, they're looking at him going, "What now, God? What now, Lord?" He says, have faith in God. I'm going to go ahead and release the campus pastors. I love you guys. A transformational moment today is the question that I asked throughout the sermon. If Jesus came to your home, how would he respond? Would Jesus look at you? Yes, he would love you. Yes, he would be pleased with you. But would he look at you and say, you're producing the fruit that I have enabled in you? Or would he ask, where's your fruit? Would he lovingly discipline you back to abiding in him so you can produce what you were created to produce? Thank you guys. Have a good day.